another episode of Anna Rose Reads the Podcast. I am your host, Anna, and today we're doing something a little different. We're venturing a little bit outside the horror genre. We're walking in some sci fi territory. That's right, I'm going to be chatting with author Philip Fracassi about his latest, The Third Rule of Time Travel, which is very obviously a time travel novel. And while you can split hairs a little bit on the genre classification of this novel, I would argue that it is a bit of a horror novel. It is a bit of a sci fi novel. And it's just a story about humanity and love and finding the priorities in your life about where you want to spend your time. I loved this book immensely. I've written a review on it, which you can all go find on my Substack. But I was really excited to get to chat with Philip. He's actually a repeat guest on the podcast. You can check out YouTube for my previous interview with Philip. But always getting to chat with him is a great time. And his outlook on the science of time travel, his perspective on the genre, and just how he constructed the story is really interesting to talk about and hear about. And so I hope that you guys enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And yeah, hope that you guys stick around after and enjoy the episode. Thanks. Hello, Philip. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Anna. Thank you. I'm doing really, really well.
Well, listen, I you're joining a very exclusive club, and that is like it's like on SNL. You've made it back onto my podcast or my interview series, whatever you want to call this.
Yeah.
Like Clay McLeod Chapman has been here twice, Liz Karen has been here twice, Rachel Harrison's been here twice. So I mean, I'm excited to have you
Well,
back.
that's good company to be in. I like those are all wonderful authors. And thank you. I look forward to getting my lapel pin.
Yeah, you get a special like members only jacket in the mail like
Yeah,
in about 6 weeks, so be on the
perfect. No,
lookout for that.
I'm glad to be back on twice. It's fun.
Great, I'm glad to hear that. So anyway, you are Philip Verkossi. If people do not know you, you are the author of such books like Gothic, Boys in the Valley, A Child Alone with Strangers, but those are some of your older works, and I want to talk to you about the stuff that you have coming out this year, more specifically, The Third Rule of Time Travel, which is coming out with Orbit Books. That is a sci-fi novel, not a horror novel. Although
Right.
I have an argument about that, that it could be a horror
Yeah.
novel. And also you have I think it's is it novelette or a novella with
It's
Shortwave.
it's it's a novelette. It's basically a short story. It's
Yeah.
so it's like a 10,000 word short story. It's about the same size of Alter and Mother, which I first published as chapbooks.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good sized short story is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. D7, which is about a haunted jukebox, which I also have a few questions about because that's an interesting story as well.
Yeah.
But let's get started. I think the best place to get started is with Third Rule of Time Travel. I'll give you the floor to kind of talk a little bit about the book and maybe just where you got inspired to write the story, and then I have a bunch of really specific questions for you about the book after that.
Right on. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Third Rule of Time Travel was a story I originally conceived of that was called Observed. It was I when I first came up with the idea, I wanted to write it as a screenplay. And and I read pretty widely, and one of the things I like to read is I read a lot of science books and layman science books like Brian Greene and Michio Kaku and I was reading a Michio Kaku book and he was talking about time travel and I don't remember all the details of it, but it's basically kind of inspired this idea of mine. I think it was like the idea that you couldn't put matter through a wormhole, and that was one of the things that made time travel one of the many things that even theoretically made time travel impossible. And so I had the thought of, well, what if you in the near future you're able to digitize somebody's consciousness and just send the data? Could you send the data through the wormhole? So that was like the root of the time machine concept. And then once I had the time machine kind of in my head, um, I started thinking about it as a story and what would the story look like, and and two scenes from the book basically just popped into my head. And and whenever that happens, I know it's like a story that I'm very excited to write, because it means that my brain is like saying, yeah, 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 we can see it, we can see it. I don't know why I said we when it comes to my brain, but there might be multiple voices in there. So so yeah, so that was I outlined it and I wrote it as a screenplay. Um, and then when I started gaining traction in the publishing world, I realized that it would be better, better served as a novel. And I figured because I'd sold a couple books and some publishers were showing interest in me, I was like, well, maybe I can get the story out there as a novel. So I rewrote the whole thing as a novel, much like I did Boys in the Valley. Yeah, and then was able to sell it to Orbit Books. And and I'm glad it's finally coming out next week. It feels like it's been a decade since I sold it to them.
Yeah.
It's probably only been a couple of years, but yeah. So that was the just, and the story. I should say what the story is about. So the story is about it's about Beth is the scientist and her husband Colson. She and Colson basically created this time machine, this technology. Colson dies tragically, which is not a spoiler. The book starts with him dead. Um, she has a young daughter she's trying to raise. She's trying to like battle these like this corporate honcho guy who um who acquired the technology, and basically Beth is sort of working for him um while she works on her invention. And so there's a lot of pressure to get it right and to keep it going, to keep it funded and all that kind of corporate stuff. In the meantime, she's dealing with her daughter and she's grieving her husband and she's trying to kind of go it alone. And so there's a lot of struggles. Um, on that front. So it's a drama and it's a thriller. And as she travels through time, back to um, places in her own lifetime, uh, the whole idea of the story is when you observe, all you do is observe, you can't alter the timeline, you can't change the present or the future. And what Beth finds out is that she doesn't know as much about the machine and about her technology as she thought she did, and that the universe is much more complex. And there's a lot more unknown than she bargained for. That's kind of the setup, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say that that's accurate. So, I won't lie to you, Phil. Whenever I saw that you were going to have a sci-fi novel coming out, I'm a huge fan of your writing, and I didn't doubt that I would be, invested, but I'm not a sci-fi reader. And
Yeah,
it's mostly because I guess in previous books that have leaned more sci-fi, I just had a really hard time sometimes connecting with the characters. And I
right.
think the brilliant thing that you did with the third rule of time travel is it's a damn human story, because you tell it through the lens of grief. I think in a way that that's what really kind of, hooks you right from the beginning. Um, was it all, and I know that you kind of talked about like the original inspiration points for the story already, but like, did you always have the idea to maybe tell this from a point of view of grief, or did that occur to you later? And like, what was that writing process like to explore this specific idea through this kind of lens?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to reply in a non-spoilery way. Um, as is always the complication when talking about things like books like this. But yeah, Beth's character was always to me very complex and very interesting. And one of the things, like the thing with Beth is, and this is answering your question in a roundabout way, but the thing with Beth is that she has to be very, very driven, and she has to be very strong and assertive and in control, because if she's not, she's going to get eaten for lunch by this corporation that she is kind of tied into, who's financing her work. And but at the same time, so she comes off as pretty hard edged, right? A lot of times. But then at the same time, she's a very generous, warm heart. She's a wonderful mother to her daughter. She's a grieving um, widow, and I think when I first, one of the scenes that came to me, and I mentioned there were two scenes that came to me when I first thought of the idea. One of the scenes is the opening of the book, which is the
Hmm.
airplane scene. And the thing with the airplane scene is it kind of set up, and a lot what it did in a lot of ways was sort of set up the rest of the story for me. Once I had that scene in my head, there were actually two scenes in my head. Like I mentioned, an airplane scene, and I'm not going to spoiler it. but the other scene I had in my head was uh the scene the scene where I don't think this is a spoiler. The scene where she has to kind of watch her husband leave for the last time,
Yeah.
and she can't stop him.
Yeah.
And so those are the two scenes that came to me. So it ended up being a lot more about grief and loss than I think I'd originally anticipated. I think I'd originally anticipated it being more of a straight thriller
Hmm.
as it pertains to the effects of the using the time machine and what happens to her and the ripple effects of that. Um, and then I think I kind of got as I wrote the book and I wrote her character more, and I think I just got kind of really fascinated by um, that grief side of things and the way she had to deal with the grief, like which is by basically shutting it out. And
Hmm.
in a way, the universe was kind of saying like, you're not going to be able to just shut it out because we're going to keep reminding you of it again and again and again. And there's a little bit of like, well, what's the point to that? What's the point of me reliving this moment, this horrible moment? What's the point of me reliving this horrible incident? And there's a moment in the book where um, the reporter character uh, says to Beth, and I think this is okay to say, um, she said, have you ever have you ever considered the fact that maybe when you're traveling in time and you're reliving these horrible moments, have you ever considered the idea that traveling is causing those horrible moments to occur, which is kind of a mind blowing moment in the story and for Beth. And so it kind of became this kind of, yes, very entangled way of like looking at grief and looking at loss and looking at tragedy. I would almost say tragedy more than grief in a way, but and so that was really interesting to me. And that's something that I pushed through and kind of made part of her arc, which was like early on in the book, she is very focused on the machine and the work. And then as the book progresses, and her story progresses, she becomes much more focused um, on loss and grief and who she is as a person, as a mother and a wife versus a scientist. So, and I guess I should say for people who are listening who haven't don't know anything about the book is there's three. The third rule of time travel. I should establish this at the beginning. There's three rules, right? There's the first rule is um, that you can only travel to moments in your own lifetime. So basically, the machine sends the traveler's consciousness to moments in their life that have already occurred. And the second rule is the travel can only last for 90 seconds. Um, and then the third rule is the traveler can only observe. So you can't step on a butterfly, you can't kill your grandfather. Um, and so that's the setup. So when I say things like she visited her past. So Beth ends up visiting these tragedies, and it's supposedly random where the machine sends the consciousness. But for Beth, it seems to be almost like a cosmic joke because every time she travels, it's like to the worst moments in her life, and there ends up being kind of a reason for that.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you answered the question the way that you did, because I love Beth dearly. I think that she's probably one of my favorite characters that you've written, because she is complex, I mean, she is a driven woman, but she's not so driven that she's neglectful or, like there's
Right.
she's complicated and, she's grieving, so she's a little messy sometimes, but she feels real. She feels like the people that we know. And I think for me, whenever I said that I had an argument about as to whether or not this could be constituting, a horror novel, I
Yeah.
my stomach hurts whenever I think about those scenes. There's certain scenes that I won't go into too much detail, but it's like you said the way that you wrote them, you set it up to kind of tip the reader off about what was coming, and the realization dawns on you as you keep reading, and it's like, oh, it's gonna get worse, it's gonna get worse, it's gonna get worse. And it's particularly some of her travel scenes, it's like, God,
Yeah.
and it is a gut punch. And then just some of the things later on in the book, some of the ramifications of this line of science, just they're haunting. Like, Beth's story to me is haunting.
Yeah.
And that comes through really clearly. So yeah, that's the side, like the humanity side of the story, but it reads a little like horror to me. I don't know if you feel the same, sitting in the writer's seat, but that's certainly how it came to me whenever I read it.
Yeah, I've actually had I actually had one reviewer tell me that it was the scariest book of, they'd read all my books, and this was the scariest book to them of all the books that they'd read.
Yeah.
And there are definitely some scenes that are, I would say, are straight up out of a horror novel.
Hmm.
A couple of her dream sequences
Yeah.
and things like that. Um, and yeah, but when I was, I know at no point when I sit down to write a book am I thinking about it, am I
Yeah.
categorizing the genre? Like I have a new book idea that's it's also kind of like there's some sci-fi elements to it. There's like aliens and stuff like that, but it's also definitely in my mind horror. But I could easily see, depending on who I sell it to, I could see it being like them saying like, "Hey, this is science fiction." Um, so yeah, I don't really think about the genre. I just think about writing the best story that I can, and I like I just tend to write things that are very dark and I like um I like the supernatural. I
Hmm.
have an affinity for the supernatural. I like writing about the supernatural because for me, say if you take someone who writes straight science fiction, for example, like you were saying, um, with straight science fiction, there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of guardrails. You can't go too far one way or the other. And one of the reasons I love writing horror so much is that you can do anything you want. There are no rules. And I think the reason so my version of science fiction, I think, is a little more on the there are no rules side of things, versus like maybe more of the hard line stuff. But at the same time, I try very hard, with this book in particular, to make sure that the theoretical physics in the book were accurate, that the time machine was as accurate as I could possibly make it. Um, I based it on, um, the science, theoretical physics of scientists like Michio Kaku and Kip Thorne, and um, and I even had a NASA physicist read the book, and they gave me feedback, and so I worked with them on like making sure that it wasn't just it wasn't just pure fantasy.
Yeah.
It's everything is based in a sort of theoretical reality, um, but yeah, I think to answer your question, I think it could be classified. Like if I had sold this to a horror publisher, I could easily see them just calling it horror, and I don't think anyone would really have batted an eye.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, because I sold it to more of a science fiction fantasy publisher, it's science fiction, but it is time travel, so it definitely has a scientific element to it. And there is a lot of science in the book as you read, and I think what I try to do for folks like yourself who maybe aren't huge science fiction fans, what I tried to really do is create the distribution of information in a way that what didn't feel too like expository. I try to really work it into the story so that you were still getting all the cool info that you wanted or maybe needed in order to understand what was happening, but at the same time, it wasn't like an info dump or it wasn't like too boring or technical. And that was a bit of a balancing act to try and get all the science in without bogging down the plot. But I also wanted it to be for those who are more traditional science fiction readers. I really wanted more traditional science fiction readers um, to feel like I was treating the science fairly, and that if they wanted to dive deeper into that side of things, they could because it's all real. The way the machine works is technically possible, theoretically possible. Um, so, like I said, but then things kind of get more as the book goes on. Things get a little bit more speculative, which is just the nature of me as a writer, I guess.
Yeah. It's so funny. I mean, you just answered about like three of my questions, or started to answer at least like three of my questions that I had
I will
here.
expound on them
Yeah. Yeah.
individually.
Yeah, and I feel like I've come to know you like through reading your stuff, and I've listened to other interviews and stuff that you've done. I've talked to you before, and so I know that you're not somebody who sits down and is like, I'm going to write horror today. I know that you're a storyteller with the ideas that come to you, and you just tell the story. So, in my mind, whenever I read this, I was like, Phil's just telling a good story, like you know what I mean? But to be honest, the setup at the beginning of the book with the plane scene that you talked about, where you initiate the three rules for time travel.
Yeah,
Um, It was really expertly written because it gave us what we needed to know, and then it showed us what we needed to know. It's like the show don't tell thing, but you were able to do both in a way that wasn't redundant. And I
Yeah.
have to ask, I know that you just mentioned that you took all the science and you met with experts and you had different people read over this draft. What was it like to try and take that expert knowledge? Because I know it can be dense and
Yeah.
factual and very dry. And then, whenever you write good fiction, it's because you're showing, not telling. It's exposition. How do you translate that? Like, what does that look like to you as an author?
What does it look like to me when I taking hard data and turning it into fiction? Is that kind of the
Yeah,
question?
pretty much. And like, how you said, you try to place the information, the
Yeah.
world building in ways that felt normal and like not overwhelming
Yeah.
to a reader. What does that look
Right.
like to you? Like whenever you're sitting there plotting or pacing or whatever, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, there's different ways to do it. I think on this one it was a little more front loaded. Like so take for example Boys in the Valley or or Serafina, my novel Serafina, which is coming out next year. That but came out in a limited edition this year or last year. That those are both historical novels, right? Historical horror
Right.
novels. So there's just like with Third World Time Travel, there's a lot of like how do I work in the historical aspects while telling the story, and it's kind of different for each book. So with Boys in the Valley, for example, the historical aspects were really I really wove in very subtly into the story because it wasn't really the at the forefront of the story. The forefront of the story were the characters and and what was happening because it was such a limited space. So most of that book takes place in one building, basically. So for me, it was like little details throughout. So you know, how do they how did they wash their hands? How did they go to the bathroom? How did they heat the building? Things like that. I didn't go out of the way to explain that, but if it came up naturally in the story, then I made sure that I was being accurate with the way that it happened. So that was kind of with Serafina. I really wanted the history was a little more front and center. Um, so it was a little more part of the book because that's a Civil War story where three brothers are basically trying to get from Shiloh, Tennessee to Natchez, Mississippi over, walking over wild terrain for it's all uncivilized and so there was a lot more of I wanted the terrain and nature and also a lot of the elements of that time with the war and what was happening with the movement west and I wanted all that to be more at the forefront. So I put a lot more of that into the story, and I made it much more a bigger, like almost like another character. With time travel, I had all this science, and for me, I needed people to understand how the machine worked, even in a very basic, rudimentary way, or just enough so that you understood, like when the plot started developing and growing more complex, you understood why things were happening and why when something dramatic happened or when a twist happened, you understood, oh, I get why shouldn't have happened. I understand. So I had to really front load the science and the information in this book. So the way I did it was I created like 3 or 4 pages of an interview that she does, Beth Darlow does with Nichio and the reporter, and so I kind of worked it as a kind of Q&A within the book about how the machine works and with some dialogue to kind of keep it snippy, keep it moving and keep it casual and kind of keep the reader more engaged because they were dealing with two personalities talking to each other versus just reading like a page of hard data or whatever. But I knew I had to front load it. So I knew I had to get all that information in there early and then probably I didn't really have to worry about it the rest of the way. So it's always a little bit different. It's always how it best serves the story and how it best serves the reader's experience of the story. So I kind of look at it that way: is how big where does the information need to go? What does the reader really need to know? And how big of a character is the is the data, if you will, or the information that I need to get across. So it's a little different with each. And I think that you go through that with any story, even if it's a modern story. There's an element of reality. Even Gothic, it's like um, I wanted to make sure that I was getting New York City right. I live in LA, so I wanted to make little things like that, and that's just research. But I think when you're talking about inputting hard data, inputting historical fiction or inputting science, it really is how how the story calls for it, you know. So that was the way I approached with time travel was I just wanted to get it all out there, um, so that people knew everything, and then they could just enjoy the story from that point on. Even not just the time machine, but also like the whole questions,
Yeah.
thing, how that worked, why, because that comes into play obviously later in the
Hmm.
story. So I needed the reader to understand how it worked, so that and it was actually been pretty good. One of the things I've been hearing early on from readers and reviewers that makes me happy is that people seem to have a very good understanding of the science of the book,
Yeah.
which is a huge win for me because the hardest part about writing the book was making sure that the science was digestible and understandable so that you could follow the plot and just kind of enjoy it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's the thing, like whenever you're a reader who reaches for something that maybe you don't normally reach for, it's the thing for me is like, oh God, am I gonna be smart enough to get, whatever, pick up whatever they're putting down? And I think the sign of a good storyteller is whenever, you make complex information accessible. And it's something to easy to kind of pick up and deal with. But back a little bit more to I hate to talk so strictly in genre, but I have to ask you about this with a time travel story. I feel like a lot of times people are used to the butterfly flaps its wings effect of, you go back, you do one thing, you mess up everything, and you no longer exist. And luckily,
Right.
you came up with three rules that kind of fail safe that. And I think that that's so smart because we've all read and seen those stories about, what happens if you go back and mess up too much stuff. Um,
Right.
was what was it like to come up with those three rules to kind of safeguard that? Because I think that that's what makes the story fresh, is that it's a different take on time travel. It's not
For
something
sure.
that we're used to.
Yeah. I think, well, what happened was is I knew that, so there's a thing called the double slit experiment, and the double slit experiment is where, um, they shoot a bunch of protons at a two slits in a thing, and the protons act one way when the people aren't looking at it, and when people are looking at it, the protons act a different way. They turn into squigglies. So and they whatever. It's always fascinating. It's a bit of a divisive experiment because a lot of scientists are like, "Oh my God, stop with the metaphysical nonsense of, this and that and other thing." There's the hard science to explain what's happening, and like Neil deGrasse Tyson will say, he'll probably, he would laugh anyone out of the room who thought like it was more like metaphysical or supernatural element, something going on. But there are other scientists like I don't want to speak for Michio Kaku, but I think he's a little more open minded about it. So but what was interesting to me about that was I was like, I thought it was so cool that just by observing um, reality, um, you were altering it, you were changing it. And so when I came up with the rules, one of the rules was that you could, the time traveler could only observe. They couldn't actually affect what was happening. They couldn't step on the butterfly, like I said. They couldn't kill their grandfather. So I thought that establishing that as a rule and then breaking that rule um, was sort of like the impetus for a lot of the plot of the story. And so once I had that kind of one rule, I was like, well, I think it'd be kind of cool to have like a set of rules that are kind of pre-established with this form of time travel. And the whole like you can only travel the points in your lifetime. I should really refresh my knowledge on how I came up with that, but there actually is there is some element of science behind it where but you had to get I wrote this book 3 years ago, folks.
Yeah.
So but the idea is that I really like two novels since that's why I've completely forgotten most of the information. But the idea is that in theoretical space time, space-time travel, you can only go to points in your pre if you were to bend space and like the Matthew McConaughey sticking the pencil through the paper thing in Interstellar, then you can only go to things that have existed in your lifetime. So, um, in theory, so that was kind of like, well, I'm trying to keep this as grounded as possible. And so once I had the whole like, well, you can only observe, you can only go to points in your lifetime, which actually ended up playing into a lot of the grief and plot points that you talked about. And because that was actually, and then also, again, when that rule is ultimately broken, so I don't think it's a spoiler, um, it leads to some pretty interesting consequences. So, and then from there, then the 90 seconds thing came from when I was studying lasers and researching negative energy and in the future if we have negative energy, how much, blah blah blah. And and I think it had to do with how much energy it would take to to fuel basically something as powerful as this machine. And I generally came up with about 90 seconds was like a realistic number because the more than that, you're talking like nuclear facilities kind of thing. So anyway, so I ended up establishing these like three rules, and they all get broken in the book, and there's because there's only and anyone who looks at the back of this book and sees the marketing material and says there are three rules and those three rules can't be broken, they're going to be broken, right? That's the so I don't think it's a spoiler, but yeah, so that's how I came up with the rules. It started with the idea of you can the double slit experiment can only observe, and then would it be cool if like you by observing you were changing things, and then it went from there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, I can't help but laugh. I mean, you can't put rules there unless you're gonna break them. I mean, Um,
Anytime you see somebody put a rule on a book jacket, you know it's going to be shattered
yeah.
with devastating, horrific consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But speaking of devastating, I mean, I think the book on the whole, when you look at it, I think you definitely succeed. I know that you really cared about the science. I could tell the amount of detail and effort that you put into getting the science across, but more than anything, I think it's a story that's very rooted in humanity. And it's kind of through the
yeah,
grief and coming to value the moments that you cherish, most in your life and things like that. And it takes a turn towards that way. And I think it's a really poetic book for that reason. Um, and so it it's another book, and I hate to compare it to 11/22/63, but it's another time travel book that's not really a time travel book that it feels like, it feels
yeah,
like it's a story about love and humanity. And do you see it that way as well at the end of the day?
yeah. I mean, ultimately the book is about what's important
Yeah.
and what's not important, and it's ultimately yes, you mentioned like the grief element of it, and Beth dealing with the grief, but also the uncertainty of her future that has nothing to do with time travel, and having like a little girl and 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 so yeah, for me it was really about the connection between those three characters, Colson
Hmm.
and Beth and Isabella, the daughter, and it was really about finding your way home. I mean, there was almost like an Odyssey almost feel
Yeah.
element to it where it was kind of like how are these like Colson's you know uh, died horribly, but he's still a character in the story, and I think him, there's this I can't so much I can't say, but there's like a story behind the story, which
Yeah.
kind of fascinates me as a writer, which is that there's like a whole nother novel right beneath the novel that you're reading, and you only see glimpses of that novel, but you do see glimpses of it, and I think for me that was really interesting was that I kind of felt like when I was writing this story about Beth, I was writing a whole another novel about Colson,
Yeah.
that was taking place sort of simultaneously that the reader doesn't get to really see a lot of, and so yeah, it was about these people sort of like reconnecting, discovering what's important, and then again, no spoilers, but and at the end it's really, I think, that point's driven home,
Yeah.
which is that there's some. decisions made where, yeah, it's all about the time travel almost becomes, the time travel element is almost like, in a lot of ways it's a plot device to get
Yeah.
to reconnect these people. So, and make them show them, um, what's important in their lives, I guess. So, and also just like how to deal with like what is grief, like you just, there's what is tragedy and the way tragedy affects you and the way tragedy shapes you into who you are, I think is kind of fascinating too.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I could see, no, it's really, just like, I mean, yeah, I think like I said, it's a backdrop, like even
Yeah.
like the Civil War is a backdrop to Serafina, and the cruelty of, you know, uh, turn of the century orphanages were is a backdrop to Boys in the Valley. It's really always about, for me, it's always about the characters
Yeah.
and their arcs and their relationships and what they're each trying to achieve. And I think that that's the most fascinating thing for a reader too. It's like, well, maybe we won't touch on it too much, but like even Autumn Springs, I wrote this book called Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre, and which is literally a slasher in a retirement home. But before I could really write the book, I had to understand what's the journey for these
Hmm.
characters. Um, and that book is really, although it is a horror slasher, um, categorically speaking, and it is entertaining in that horror slasher way. Um, it is very intense. It is a very intensive character study, about trust and about aging and about, you know, again, kind of like that sense of overcoming personal tragedy, um, and sort of like figuring out how do you mold your current existence with, how does tragedy mold you, and then how does that affect your current existence and your future. So there's a lot of those things that I really enjoy writing about. And even this book I'm going to write about like cults and aliens probably next year. Before I could even start outlining that story, I had to find the human root of it, and it's really about a father and a daughter and their relationship and that bond and so forth. So it's very important to always have the characters always have to be at the forefront of every story.
Hmm.
And then yeah, and then really the rest is sort of like, um ways to get them from A to Z,
Yeah.
and how, and in a way that's entertaining and fun for readers. But ultimately, you want that satisfaction and that fulfillment of like having experienced and gone through something with another human being, which is, I think, what makes reading, gives it a depth and gives it an emotion and gives it human connection that I think just like a straight, you know, time travel story might not.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, I felt like I was sitting next to Beth and holding her hand all throughout this one. I can guarantee it.
Oh, that's
But
good to hear.
yeah, but I do want to shift gears a little bit because I feel like we've shined a really deep light on the third rule of time travel. And I want to shift to your upcoming release, D7 from Shortwave, which is that haunted jukebox novelette that we mentioned.
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead and just maybe give us a little bit of inspiration on that one because that man, it's kind of a nasty little story that you wrote there, Phil.
It is a nasty little story. That now, what's interesting with, short fiction, the reason I love writing short fiction as much as I love writing novels is because it's the different. I don't have to do all that stuff that I just talked about with the novel. I can just have something really crazy happen, and I don't have to worry. I mean, yes, you want your characters to be developed, and you want there to be empathy, but you don't. But it's a short story. There's only so much you're
Yeah.
going to be able to do. So for me, short stories are a little bit more I was just watching a review that Tim Bedwell did on his channel of D7, and he really emphasized how much it feels like a Twilight Zone
Yeah.
episode, and um, and that's a huge compliment to me because I really love writing Twilight. I always feel like my short stories are sort of all sort of, Twilight Zone episodes, or Alfred Hitchcock Presents, or whatever, um, amazing stories, whatever you want to call it. The serial, as little serial, um, fun, hooky, um, dark, often darkly comedic in a way, with like a nice twist, and not all my stories are like that, but sometimes, but the ones but sometimes I like to really, that's how I kind of like sometimes think about when I'm writing a story is, I want this to be sort of like, Twilight Zone episode or whatever. So D7 was definitely inspired. I'm trying to remember there's two things that inspired D7 from a kind of subconscious perspective, I guess, is one, a long time ago, I read a short story. I don't think, was it it might be a novel. I can't remember, but it was written by Horace McCoy, and it's called "They Shoot Horses, Don't They?" And it's about a dance marathon where basically the last couple standing wins, right? And you dance for like 4 days or whatever it is, and people are dehydrated and whatever. And that used to be a thing, I think, in the 60s and 50s. I'm not sure, that's what that story's about. And so that was always kind of like lodged in my brain, you know, and then I'm trying to remember if there was an inspiration for the jukebox. I mean, I came up. Sometimes I just have weird ideas, and they get written
Yeah.
down, and I'll be like haunted jukebox, and I'll like stick it in a thing, and I'll forget about it for a year. Um, but I think it was just the idea of kind of combining that element of they shoot horses, don't they, and put it in a little bit more of a modern setting and and give it a supernatural twist.
Yeah.
Um, and I think with that story in particular, I'm trying to remember. But there's a moment in the there's two moments in the story which I'm not going to spoil. But one is at the ending, which I think was kind of like one of those things that came to me very quickly when I first had the idea, and that sort of like propelled the whole story. 'Cause I didn't I knew I needed it. I never write a short story until I know how it ends.
Hmm.
I always have to know how it ends. I have to. I can't write it otherwise. So because for me as a writer, I feel like everything I'm doing is to get to that ending.
Yeah.
So if I don't know where I'm going, then I don't really, I can't do it that way. It's too just like meandering for me. I got to
Yeah.
feel like I'm driving toward an end goal. And then so there's that, and then there's another element. There's another part of the story. There's like a mid-story twist where the couple who go into the honky tonk and are kind of trapped there. Um, you find out something about the couple that's like kind of change, kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. So, so yeah, so I mean, it's always hard to discuss inspirations because you never know where they come from. I mean,
Yeah.
every now and then you can be like, I remember the moment, I remember for like, I wrote a story called Alter, um, that's coming out as a movie later this year from A24, hopefully. Um, and I remember like the moment I came up with Alter. I remember sitting by a pool, and for some crazy reason, the thought hit me, which was like, I was like, I don't know why this thought hit me, but I was like, huh, I wonder what would happen if there was a sinkhole opened up beneath this pool. And then I was like, I wonder what would happen if this pool was filled with children. What would happen? Like, would they all get sucked? And that was like, I remember that moment, like, and that became Alter, which is much more about, there's a lot more stuff in it, but that's kind of the root of the idea. And so every now and then you feel, but I just wrote a story called Firm, which is about a haunted mattress of all the stupid things. And it's this like horrible, graphic, just dark and dirty story that I just wrote. And it's like 12,000 words long. It's longer than D7. And I sold it for an anthology for Titan. But like that was literally like a dream that I had. It was a
Yeah.
dream. I had a dream about this mattress being about a haunted mattress and a mattress salesman,
Oh, yeah.
uh, right? And I was like, what if there was a mattress salesman who was like selling like haunted mattresses? That'd be weird. And what would that mean? What would that look like? And so that's what Firm became. So you never know.
I do get that, but with D7 in particular, and for me, like anytime that there's a tie between music, like a song, and
Yeah,
fiction. I'm always like, I feel like something had to have inspired that. It's specific, and I don't think that you give us an exact song that's playing on the jukebox in D7.
it's whatever song
Yeah,
D7 is. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And
no,
so I just had to wonder.
I
I'm
think I
like, what
describe it a little bit,
song
but
would drive Phil to write about
right.
this?
Yeah,
You
was there a
know?
specific song? Yeah, it's a good question actually. I don't think there is. I don't listen to a lot of rockabilly, which is kind of the way I kind of saw the honky tonk playing. But I
Yeah,
think anytime, yeah, no, I don't know. I don't think there's a song, but I wish there was. Um, but so I could like say that there was. But no, I think it was just the idea that there was a song,
yeah,
and and um and when that song was played, um then yeah, then bad things happened. And it was also that was an interesting story to write because I had to there was a lot of stuff, and this doesn't happen to me all the time, but in D7 there were a lot of things I had to fix, meaning
okay.
like I had to set up my head. I knew it was going to happen. But then as I was writing the story, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Why wouldn't they just do this? Or wait, why don't they just do that? Or wait, this would have solved it. Or this would, this would have. And so sometimes you know how you watch a movie or whatever, and you're like, why don't they just go out the garage or whatever?
Yeah,
And you're yelling at the screen like dummies. And so I didn't want there to be any of those like, why didn't they just do this moment? So I had to kind of like fix a lot of stuff in that to make sure that the hot box that they were all trapped in was really just like with Boys in the Valley. I had to bring, there was the blizzard that sort of trapped them there, and then I created that isolation. Um, but I kind of knew that all going in. Whereas this it was much like when I wrote a story called Shiloh, which is also another Civil War story, and a novella. And it was funny writing Shiloh. That was my first experience really realizing how horrible research um, is, and realizing how horrible it is to why am I writing historical fiction? This was a terrible idea, and because you don't realize how much stuff there is. Like you're
yeah,
like a guy gets like he picks up his gun. Well, what kind of gun is it? What kind of ammo does he have? Where does he hold his ammo? And then there's a scene where like a guy's hurt, so they have to like remove his clothes, and I'm like, well, what's he wearing underneath his uniform? Like, what kind of underwear did they have back then? There was a moment in Serafina where they go, they go to cut their hair because they
hmm
have lice in their hair. So she's like, you have to go cut your hair in the creek and shave your scalps and here's soap and whatever. And I was like, did they have scissors in 1862? I don't know. Did they have right? You want to think about it, but these are the things that come up, and so I had to like look it up. And what kind of scissors did they have, and what kind of soap did they have, and so I hate writing historical fiction. I hope I never have to do it again. I promised myself after writing Shiloh that I would never write another historical story again, and then I wrote a whole goddamn novella. I mean, a whole novel called Serafina, and I was like, why am I doing this? It's like I feel like I'm writing a book report every page.
yeah,
Um, but anyway, so yeah, I don't know. With D7, it was nice to not have to worry about that too much.
yeah,
I could just kind of make stuff up. Um, but even that with like modern technology, like there's a moment in D7 that I really like, which is not a spoiler from the first few pages of the book, where they're a little bit lost and they're checking their GPS. And the GPS in the car is like showing, how it shows you the road that you're the blue
yeah,
dot on the road or whatever. And there's a moment where like they're like, "Where are we?" And they look at the GPS and they see like there's a road, and the blue dots like moving in this like sea of green, like and the road's getting further and further away from the blue dot. And that was because as a writer, one of the things you do in screenplays or in stories is you create the story world and then you create like the real world. And there's a separation between the two. It's like, well, now you're entering the story world. The rules are different, and so that was like kind of like a hard metaphor for like there we are leaving the real world, folks. We are entering the story world or the ghost world, as it's sometimes called in screenplay novels, but or screenplay self help books. But so yeah, so anyway, there's always something. But yeah, I don't remember. I wish I could remember why the jukebox was how the jukebox came to me. It was probably just something I thought of and wrote down at some point that wouldn't it be cool if there was a haunted jukebox that played a song that drove everybody nuts?
yeah. No, I get that, but I mean, again, I have an idea of what my song would be. It would probably
What would
be
your song
it
be?
would probably be like some terrible country song like Boots Scootin' Boogie or something, but I
Yeah.
mean, that's just me.
It's got to be something you can two-step to, I think,
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
there's some two-stepping in that story.
there
So
is.
yeah,
There's a lot of
it's probably
two-step.
right. I would imagine it definitely was probably like, yeah, a country, certainly a country song, maybe one with a little more of a rock and a kind of a hard bass drum beat going on behind it. But yeah, anything amplified enough is terrifying, even if
Yeah,
it's
no,
like,
that's true. That's very true. Yeah.
even if it's Sade. You turn that, like in Gothic, you turn that song up loud enough, you know, it gets yeah, Tony Braxton, right? On Break My
Yeah.
Heart. You turn on Break My Heart up loud enough, it can be scary.
No, I totally agree with that. And I think that the Twilight Zone comparison is very apt for D7. It feels that, and for the life of me, I feel like I saw a movie, saw a TV episode, like a limited series kind of thing, or I read a short story that was very much about like a couple that goes into a bar and there's like a mural on the wall and like they become part of the mural that's on the wall. And for the
Oh,
life of me,
interesting.
I can't remember what or where it was from. If somebody who's listening to this knows, like, please tell me because it is eluding me.
Well,
Um,
I
but it
will
had
say
similar
this,
vibes.
it is a bit of a trope. The lost couple goes into the honky
Yeah.
tonk. It's been done. I mean, there was a Stephen King story that I do not remember the name of, um, but I remember the setup, and the setup was a couple driving in a car at night, lost, irritated with each other, and I honestly don't remember what happened, but it, but that trope is a great setup for any
Yeah.
horror story. And I think something that was it's fun with D7 is I kind of take that sort of trope, and hopefully do something very fresh with it. That's
Oh
maybe
yeah.
a little bit unexpected. Um, I don't think anybody expected what happens in D7
I
happen,
don't I
but
would argue not. I would
yeah.
argue not. Oh man, no. I think it's a fun little nasty. It's hard to, I feel bad calling it fun, but it is kind of fun. A fun
No,
little
it's super
nasty piece of
fun.
horror. Yeah, I think
No,
it's fine.
Firm is really fun too, but I mean, all of my stuff, I like to think of a lot of my stuff as fun because it is supposed to be entertaining. That's the point. I mean,
Yeah.
there are stories that I write that are not supposed to be fun. And when you read a story that's not supposed to be fun. If you ever, okay, I have a story in No One Is Safe, my latest
Hmm.
collection. It's called Autumn Sugar. And Autumn Sugar is not supposed to be fun. You are not going to come out of that story and be like, "Hey, that was kind of fun." I'm sort of like, but you'll read it and you'll be like, "Oh, that was really dark. That was really dark, and that was really
Yeah.
horrible." But and not that it's graphic or anything like that, but it's just not a fun story.
There's
It's
like a
an
weight to
example.
it, right? It's like a it's a weight. It's like a
There's a definite
yeah.
weight to it. Yeah, and I wrote it with it very purposely. It's kind of like my Andre Debut homage,
Hmm.
as a horror story. But yeah, but for the most part, I try for my stories to be fun, which is interesting because No One Is Safe. Thematically, I really wanted to be kind of like a fun collection of horror stories, like Aquarium Diver, like the guy dives into the blob and stuff like that. Um, but that particular story is pretty dark, and that's also ended up in that collection. I think I just wanted it to like counterweight. I didn't want people to have too much fun.
I gotcha. That makes sense.
I
That
wanted to
makes
make sure
sense.
people were a little scarred, and then
Yeah,
back to
you had to
you.
traumatize somebody at least once. I
Right,
mean, you know, yeah.
right. Yeah,
I
I
get
think that
it.
was my
I get
thinking.
it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. And before, we sign off, I want to give you a chance. I mean, it's a busy year for you. You've got Third Rule of Time Travel coming up. You got D7 that's coming out. Then the Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre. Did I say that in the right order? Because I never say it in the right order, I
Yeah,
feel like.
yeah. Just call it
That's co
Autumn Springs. That's fine.
Yeah, that's coming out in the fall. So what does the rest of 2025 look like for you as far as like events, releases, things like that?
Yeah, I'm doing a very small tour for see, even I get confused for third world time travel. I'm basically just doing a couple Southern California dates. I'm going to be at AuthorCon 5 in Williamsburg, Virginia at the end of the month. And then I'm doing I'm going to a store in Albuquerque because they're hosting me, which is very nice. And then that's kind of it. And I have that opportunity, and then and then I have an opportunity to go to Spain in July. I'm going as a guest of honor for a for a literary festival in Spain. So that'll be really fun. Um, I haven't been to Spain before, but then when I do, as far as events and stuff like that, that's pretty much it. AuthorCon 5 is the big one. I'll probably be at StokerCon. I definitely will be at StokerCon. Um, and then a couple Southern California events. I'm doing Mysterious Galaxy and a store here in LA. And then, but when I do, when Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre comes out, I'm definitely going to do a bigger tour for that.
Mhm.
Going to do some. I'm going to do some West Coast stuff, some East Coast stuff, and try and hit some stuff in the middle. It won't be as extensive Boys in the Valley, but it'll probably be like eight, nine, 10 stores. I'll probably
Yeah.
do. I'll be in the East Coast for that, but that won't be to your point. That'll be like in October. Um, and then then in April of next year, my novel Seraphina is coming out from Clash.
Yes.
And then at the end of next year, TBD, probably going to be releasing a sequel to Gothic 2, which is, I think, going to be called Gothic the End.
Ooh, I like that. Well,
Yeah,
I mean, I love Gothic. I love
you're
Gothic
right.
very
Yeah.
much. So
So
I'm very excited for that.
that should be coming out next year as well. I have to write that one, but I know I already have it all outlined. So the story's kind of there. I just have to write it. So so a couple books next year as well. And they had a couple surprises coming out. Um, that haven't been announced yet. So there'll be some other stuff throughout. But yeah, so that's kind of my upcoming schedule though, as far as releases and and touring and whatnot.
Yeah, that's very exciting, and I'm also equally as intrigued by those surprises that you may or may not be able to mention anytime soon. Um,
Yeah, just some fun deluxe editions and things of
yeah,
that nature are going to be hitting over the next year and a half.
nice, nice.
That
Those are I always love a good deluxe edition. I mean, I can't help myself when it comes to artwork. Whenever it's related to books, I eat it up so bad. I mean, like I can't help myself. So
Yeah,
that's
I like
always
them
good news
too.
to hear.
I always like having a nice copy of, like a nice deluxe copy of one of my books. It's always nice to have those, and leave them behind for the kid or whatever. But yeah, and I'll probably have another novella out next year as well. I'm
Nice.
writing it. Yeah, I have a story called Overpass,
Hmm.
that I'm probably going to be writing this spring. Um, and that's going to be, I think it's a fun one. So, and that'll probably come out next year. And oh, and I should say, speaking of Gothic is not currently available because I switched publishers. The book has gone from Cemetery Dance to Clash.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Um, for just because Clash and I are doing some other stuff together. So CD was very nice about reverting rights and everything. Um, so that new book's gonna come out in August.
Oh, perfect.
The new edition of Gothic will come out in August. Yeah, so it'll be back in print pretty quickly.
Oh, nice. That's good to know. And I know a few people. I keep recommending that book to a lot of people, so
Yeah,
it'll be good to be able to point them in that direction. But
yeah.
no, that all sounds really, really exciting, Philip. And thank you so much for your time. And as always, entertaining all of my questions and just being like so thoughtful in every response. It means so much. I'm really excited for people, the general public, to get their hands on the third rule of time travel. I think it's a really, really interesting book that just it just feels like it tackles it all. Like it feels like it handles the science part, the interesting, thought-provoking side of the science, and then it also gives you a lot to think about emotionally. So I'm really, really pumped for that. But thank you so much,
Thank
Philip. I
you,
really appreciate your time.
thank you, and I appreciate it.
Anytime. As always, a huge and enormous thank you to Philip for his time. Just being able to sit down and answer all of my questions about this novel that I love so much means absolutely everything. And I hope that that came through in our conversation. If you haven't picked up the third rule of time travel yet and you're a little hesitant, maybe like me, to be reading sci fi when you're normally either a horror reader or a thriller reader, I think that you're in safe hands with this book. I think that it kind of crosses a lot of genre lines and it doesn't really belong squarely in any one box. Philip just knows how to write a really good story that's really compelling. So, like I said, if you're on the fence, I highly recommend giving this one a go. And if you need to be even further convinced, my review is available on my Substack. Next week on the podcast, I will have my episode with Tyler Jones up and ready for your listening pleasure. And after that, it's a little bit of a surprise even to me. I'm still working out the schedule for the next couple of weeks. So just stay tuned. Follow me on social media for all updates regarding the podcast. And yeah, I hope that you all enjoyed this episode per usual. And I hope that you're all doing well wherever you're at in this very crazy time that we're living in. So until next time, see you.